Hi, and welcome to my first video post. I started this one out as a normal blog post, but I noticed that it was a bit too much to use text. So I'm trying to record this as a presentation instead. So I'm going to talk about how to remove translations in Episerver. My name is Alf Nilsson. I am a systems developer at NetRelations. You can find my tweets at Alf Nilsson. You can email me if you have any questions or comments. You can find some code that I have been playing around with at my GitHub. You can see my other blog posts at talk.alfnilsson.se. So we had a problem. We had an existing website and we want to create a new one where the content is similar to the first one and based on the first website's content structure, which is quite large content structure. The original website also had some different languages and we only needed one of these, the German one, which fortunately is the master language for most of the content. So we wanted to remove all the other languages, and we first looked at how to do this with the Episerver API, and we noticed that the content structure was a bit too complex for this. So we needed to do this straight in the database. Normally, I don't recommend that you do your changes in the database. If you have an API, I really recommend that you use that one instead, but sometimes you need to be so drastic that you go to the database and do your changes. So we needed to know how does Episerver work with content and how is it stored in the database, especially when it comes to languages and versions. So what is a language? Episerver uses the concept of culture info from the .NET framework, which means that you have a language and some rules for the alphabet and special characters. You have some rules for the number and currency formatting and formats for date and time. The culture info is primarily defined on which language it has. It doesn't really matter of which culture or country the language belongs to. So for example, English that you can find in the United States, in UK, Australia or New Zealand. Well, all of these countries speak English, but they have the different currencies and they have different ways to format the time. So you need to add the culture as well. So for example, you could have American English, British English, Australian English, or New Zealand English. In Episerver, the language is basically a translation of each content. The language needs to be enabled in admin mode and available in the tree structure. And the properties that you want to translate needs to be culture specific. Otherwise, they'll use the value from the master language. And the master language is basically the language that the content first was created on. So let's take a look at how it is working in Episerver. So here in admin mode, I'll go to the config tab and click on manage website languages. You can here see that I have enabled English and Swedish. If you want to change this, you just click on that language and change the enable checkbox. In the content structure, I have on the root page made sure that among the available languages, I have English and Swedish. It's quite easy to change that as well. You can also change which languages should be available further down in the tree structure. But first of all, it's most common that you have this set on the root page. I also have a page here. It has a name, a created date, an image, a body, and you can see that I have some currency and alphabetical order examples. So looking at the view, you can see that I'm just doing this number 0 to string with a currency flag. I also have an array of characters, and we have some Swedish characters, å, ä, and ö. I want to sort that by the character and output that. As you can see, in just English, we have the $sign, and the characters that are more similar to the A character are sorted next to the A character, and the one that is more similar to the O character is somewhere in the middle. So using the gadget languages, which I really recommend, you can download it as a NuGet package from Episerver feed. I'm going to create a translation to Swedish. with this language gadget, I can also say if I want to create a blank translation or use the English content, which is the master language, as a template. So I'm going to do that. So it creates a draft. I'm going to open that draft. And here I can change the name from hello to the Swedish word hey. And from good morning, I'm going to say good morgon, which is the Swedish translation. Taking a look at the properties mode, you can see that I can't change the image. So taking a look at the admin mode on the content type page, you can see that it's only the body that is localized. I can't do anything with it. Taking a look at code on that page type, you can see that it's only the body property that has the culture-specific attribute. So that is why I cannot change the image when I'm working with the Swedish translation of it. I'm going to publish this. As you also can see, the currency is changed from the dollar to Swedish kroners, and according to the Swedish alphabet rules, those special characters are added in the end of the alphabet. So that is what you can do with languages in Episerver. Otherwise, we have the version concept. So what is a version? In Episerver, we have the current published version, and when you start working with your content, you create drafts, and you can also go back to previously published versions. So once you create content, it has some various states in a life cycle. So a created one is a draft. For a draft, you can say that you want to make it ready to publish, or checked in as it's called in code, which means that you can change this version, and what you can do is either reject it or go straight to publish. You can also schedule a content to publish, which means that's, for example, 12 o'clock tomorrow morning, it's going to be published. So we're going to keep the current version until then. And of course, we have the published version, which means that this is a version that is visible for your for the audience on your website. So when you have a published version, it starts to create new versions. You're going to create a draft next to the published one. And once that one gets published, your current published version will get previously published. So looking at a technical concept, basically a translation Episerver is a version, but it's only a specific language among the versions. And you can set how many versions for each content do you want to save in history, which is quite important in your production environment so you don't fill your database with old previously published versions. So let's take a look at Episerver, how it works. So first of all, I'm looking at web config. You can see that in the Episerver section, application settings, I've set the maximum amount of versions that can be saved for each content is 10. So once I create the 11th version, it's going to start removing the older ones. So using the versions gadget in Episerver edit mode, you can see that now I have two versions of this content, a Swedish one and English. Both are published and both are published by me. So if I go back to the English version, I'm going to change the name from hello to so long, and from good morning to good evening. You can see that we created a draft here, and I can go from here to ready to publish, which means that I can't work with this content unless me or someone else rejects these changes. We'll go back to the state rejected. I can now work with the content, and I can say that I want to schedule it for publish. So for example, tomorrow at 12 o'clock, these changes will go published. You can see that we have a status called schedule for publish. And I can't do anything with this content unless I remove scheduling and go back to the previous state, which was rejected. So I'm going to publish this one, and you can see that my current published version will get previously published and my new one will get published. Going back to the Swedish version, you can see that we're using the same image as the English one. I'm just gonna change the wording, and you can see that now we have a new Swedish draft, but we still have the Swedish published version. Change it from good morning to god kväll. Publish this, and again the Swedish version will get previously published and the new one will get published. So going back to the English one, I'm gonna change an image. So instead of this coffee image, I'll go to media and I'll have this statue image. Use that one instead. I'm gonna publish that one. You can see that I have a nice picture of a statue instead. So going back to the Swedish version, you can see that automatically the image for the Swedish version, the Swedish translation, will become the statue image. So that is how you easily can work with the basics of languages in Episerver. So the database structure. Looking at the different tables that Episerver is using to store your content, we'll first start with the table language branch, which contains all the languages available in an Episerver solution. This is ones that is used in the edit mode when you edit or enable your languages. Looking in the database, we have one row for each language, and the language ID is the culture info ID, which tells you whether or not it has a culture or not, and at least which language it belongs to. We have the name, which is visible if you want to list your languages for the visitor, and the enabled column, which basically is whether or not you can have this language available on the website. Keep in mind that the ID of the English language is 1 and the ID of the Swedish language is 8. Don't blame me that Episerver is using the American flag for English. The next table to look at is the table content type. This contains every content type that you define. The old school way was to use the admin mode to create your page types. But in Episerver 7, or if you use Page Type Builder, you could use code to define your content types. Each content has their properties as well, stored in the table property definition. They know which content type they belong to through the foreign key content type ID. So looking in the database, the most important columns in this context would be that we have a content type with ID of 5 and the name page, and 2 rows where the content type ID foreign key has the value of 5. It is the image and the body, and since one of them is translatable and the other is not, they have different values in the language specific column. They have the name, which corresponds to the .NET property name in your code, and what kind of information is stored in this one. So for example, is it a text or is it an image? So keep in mind that the image has the ID of 1 and the body has the ID of 2 in this example. So what about the content? So first of all, we have the table content. It contains all the content that you create. Basically, it's what you can see in the tree structure in edit mode, or in the asset pane if you're working with blocks and media. The table content, which content type they belong to through the foreign key content type ID. It also knows where in the page tree structure or content structure it belongs to through the foreign key parent ID, which refers back to the table content. So it knows where in the tree structure are they positioned. It also knows what is the master language branch ID, which refers to the TBL language branch. Looking in the database, we have one content with ID of 5. It has the content type ID 5, which would be my only content type right now. It is positioned as a child to the root page, which has the ID of 1. And it is an English content looking at the master language. So looking at the languages, they are stored in the table TBL content language. And even if you're working with only one language on the website, you'll still have this structure with a TBL content language. It knows which content it belongs to through the foreign key content ID. It knows which language it is a translation from using the foreign key language branch ID. Looking in the database, we have two translations. We have the English one and the Swedish one with the names hello and hey. They also refer to which version they belong to, which we'll take a look at in a moment. Each translation has their content properties with the values that they have. For example, the coffee image and the text good morning. These are stored in the TBL content property table, which knows which TBL property definition they have and which content they belong to. They also know which translation is this value connected to using the foreign key language branch ID. And basically using the combination of the foreign keys content ID and language branch ID, you basically get a relation between the TBL content language and TBL content property. They are not any real foreign keys, but you can use them when you're browsing the database to find the correct properties for your correct languages. So looking in the database, we only have 3 rows. We have 2 for the body and 1 for the image because the Swedish version could not have their own image. Therefore, we only have 1 for the image, which is the English one. Since there are different definition types, the image is where you select an image from the asset pane. It has the value of 8, and the long string table for the text fields, which could have the good morning text in English and good morgon for Swedish. So in the versions, this is where things are getting a bit more complex. Versions are called work content in the data structure. And it's a slightly similar structure as the languages, just a more combined version of it. So the table work content contains all your versions. It knows which content they belong to the foreign key content ID. It knows which language this version belongs to through the foreign key language branch ID. And as I mentioned previously, the primary version for the content language is stored in the version column of TBL content language. So looking in the database, we can see that we have 4 rows here, 2 English ones and 2 Swedish ones, since I changed some things in my translations. And they have different status based on that. One is previously published and one is the current published one. In the same way as translations have their own content properties stored in a table, we have the TBL work content property table, which knows which work content they belong to through the work content ID foreign key. It also knows which property on the content type to refer to using the foreign key property definition ID. So looking in the database, we have quite a few of properties in this one. So first of all, we have the English version, the one that we created first, which has the image and the body, good morning, and the coffee cup image. They're both English. Then we created a Swedish version, and again, these only have the body property, which would be good morgon. Then we, in this example, changed both the image and the text for the English version. So I have 2 rows here, which are English, with the text good evening and a reference to the statue image. And in the end, we created a Swedish version, changed the text to god kväll. So that is how Episerver store the information in the tables in the database. So let's take it one more time in a more abstract point of view. So first of all, we have a content with the ID of 5, and it is created in the English language. Since it is a content, it has the translation with the name hello. And this translation also have the body property and the image property with the word good morning and the coffee cup image. And each translation that we work with creates their own version, and of course each version has their properties as well. So we create a Swedish version, which is called Hej. It only has a body with the Swedish word for good morgon, and since it doesn't have their own image, since the image is not culture specific, we kind of borrow the coffee cup image from the English translation. And the Swedish one also has their version. So we change the English translation, the name and the value of the body, which will create a new version. So we change the name and body for the Swedish translation, which will create a new version. And changing the image on the English translation will, of course, create a new version. And we will also start using the image from the published version in English to the Swedish translation. So what's next? Next post I'm going to send out is going to be an explanation on how did we use this information to remove the languages in our website. So we only had the German language. So what I hope that this post gives you is some information about how is everything stored in the Episerver database. One of the most common ways I'm using this is to take a look at something is wrong with the properties and I can't really tell using the Episerver interface. So I'm looking at the TBL content property tables to see what's wrong with the content area or the XHTML fields or whatever. And by that I need to know which language does it belong to and which content does it belong to. But I hope that this gives you some help about how to work and understand the data structure for Episerver when it comes to languages and versions and content. So you can find out some more information on what I have been sharing at GitHub, at Twitter, or my blog. So I hope that this gives you something more to read about for now. Please give me some comments about how you think this video recording went, and if you have any other questions or comments about languages and versions in Episerver. Thanks.